We talked about constructors briefly in the last module, and from that we know that a constructor is executable code that's used during the creation of our object to set up that initial state. And remember that we worked with our flight class in the last module, right? And we saw that flight class had a constructor in it. Now, one thing that's interesting to note is that a constructor is not a method. It is executable code, but it's not a method. You'll notice that constructors don't have a return type, right? It's just the code we want to run during the construction of our object. And every class has at least one constructor. But it's interesting to note, though, if we look at our flight class, what's going on inside of our constructor isn't really necessary, right? We see setting passengers equal to 0. Well, that's not necessary because we know that ints are automatically set to 0 when they're fields in a class. And the seats equals 150, well, we could have actually put that up in the declaration of seats. So we didn't really need to have an explicit constructor here. So what happens in the case where we don't really need to have an explicit constructor? Let's take a look here at how to deal with that. Let's introduce another class. We're going to call our passenger class. And our passenger class is going to have 3 fields. And these are all related to checking bags when we get on a flight. So we have the checks bags field, which is how many bags the passenger has checked. Free bags indicates how many bags they're allowed to have for free. And then the per bag fee is what is the cost of each bag beyond the number of free bags. And let's assume that we've provided accessors and mutators for checked bags and free bags so that we can interact with that data. Well, as we can see, this class does not have a constructor. Yet, if I write code to go ahead and create a new passenger and assign it to Bob, that code will run. Well, how is that possible if we said that every class has to have at least one constructor? Well, it turns out that if you don't have an explicit constructor, Java actually provides one. You wouldn't see it in your source code, but when the class is built, Java generates a constructor that doesn't do anything. Therefore, it makes it possible to create an instance of your class without explicitly writing a constructor. And there's nothing special about that class. It'll behave normally, so you can interact with all of its methods and so forth. But classes can actually have multiple constructors. Now, the parameter list has to differ for each constructor. That's an idea we call the signature. We'll talk a lot more about how signatures work later in the course when we talk about methods in more detail. The key thing is that just the number and types of the parameters have to differ across the various constructors. So let's say that we have an issue here where we want to be able to create passengers, and as part of the creation, indicate how many free bags they're allowed to have. So all that constructor would do is accept the parameters, that number of free bags, and assign that to the field. And what that would allow us to do is to write code like this, where our passenger Jane equals new passenger 2. That calls our constructor that accepts the integer, and that sets the number of free bags for Jane to 2. Then, of course, we can then set the number of checked bags for her from there. The thing is that once we introduce this new constructor that accepts the integer free bags, the line above there where we could create Bob as a passenger would no longer compile. Because what happens is that once you write any constructors, you're now responsible for all the constructors. So that constructor that was created by Java is no longer there. The point there is that Java doesn't assume that your class needs a constructor with no arguments. Once you write any constructors, you're now responsible for all the constructors. So if we still want to allow users of our class to create instances that don't provide any arguments, we're responsible to go ahead and write a constructor that doesn't take any arguments. It doesn't have to do anything, but just by putting that there, we're saying that that code that creates an instance without providing any parameters is now valid again.